During the 1976 presidential election in the United States, Jimmy Carter, the Democratic candidate, was the heavy favorite. See, just a couple of years earlier in 1974, the Republican president Richard Nixon had to resign from office over the Watergate scandal. And when Nixon resigned, his vice president Gerald Ford ascended to the presidency. And so when it came time for the 1976 general election, naturally, the candidate from the opposing party, who was Jimmy Carter, was a heavy favorite. Voters were upset with the incumbent party. And then in September of 1976, right in the middle of the campaign, Jimmy Carter gave an interview with Playboy magazine. And in the interview, he admitted that though he had never cheated on his wife, he said, "I've looked on a lot of women with lust, and I've committed adultery in my heart many times." Now, Carter was well known for being a born-again Baptist Christian, and he thought by giving an interview with Playboy, he could reach out to a wider audience. But unfortunately for him, the move backfired. You see, evangelical Christians were offended that he would even consider doing an interview with Playboy magazine. And the regular readers of Playboy magazine, I don't know if readers is the right term, they were offended to open up their magazine and find Jimmy Carter preaching to them about God. And what should have been a landslide ended up being a very close election. Carter won, but that move almost cost him the election. In that interview with Playboy, Jimmy Carter was quoting from the teachings of Jesus, which we all know are very difficult for Jesus' followers and for others alike. In fact, there was a well-known New Testament scholar in the last century who wrote a series of books called Hard Sayings of Jesus. Jimmy Carter quoted from, and we also heard from this morning, a section of Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, a section known as the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus was teaching his 12 disciples about the Jewish law, or what they would have simply known as the law. The law was difficult. It took and takes almost the entire focus of one's life and energy to try to keep. And in his teaching to the disciples, Jesus made the law seem even more difficult than it already was. He said it's not good enough just not to murder someone. What he said is, don't get angry with others. He said it's not just enough to avoid committing adultery. He said, you shouldn't even look on someone lustfully. Jesus made the teaching of the law more intense and more difficult. And on top of that, he continued to mention that there would be some strict consequences for not following the law as he had interpreted it to them. Now, the big questions for the disciples and for all of Jesus' first century followers are the same questions that face each one of us today. Who was Jesus that he could offer such a new and authoritative teaching on the law? And also, what was his purpose in doing so. Well, I think in short, the reason that Jesus offered the teachings on the law that he did was to lead his followers step by step into a closer relationship with God. I think the first step that Jesus invited his hearers to take was to see that in his teaching on the law, that we are shown how we are all imperfect. That in a manner of speaking, we are all sinners in need of God's grace. I think one of the things that we Christians often forget is that the law came from God. And that it's something that each of us needs to wrestle with. And I think one thing that both Jews and Christians have often forgotten through the centuries is that one purpose of God's law is to show us that we are imperfect and that we are in need of grace. As we read through the gospel narratives that tell the story of Jesus' life and ministry, we see him coming into conflict with the religious leaders of his day. And one of the beefs that Jesus had with those religious leaders is that most of them seemed to think that they were doing God's law pretty well perfectly. And that the big problem in the world had nothing to do with them and had everything to do with other people who weren't as good as they were. And so part of the purpose of Jesus' teaching is to highlight for religious people how they were not as perfect as they thought they were. Some of you may remember a news story from about 10 years ago. It was a small item, but it caught my eye. There was a professional basketball player in Philadelphia who, it turned out, had racked up thousands and thousands of dollars worth of unpaid parking tickets. Well, it turned out that everywhere he went, he would park his Rolls-Royce Phantom or his Cadillac Escalade or another one of his fancy cars in a handicapped space all around town, including for one whole week at the Philadelphia airport. Now, I'm sure every other reader of that piece thought exactly what I did. What an inconsiderate jerk. But the truth is, there's lots of times when I've been an inconsiderate jerk as well. I remember when I was in university, I had a part-time job at a store. And I lived in downtown Kingston, Ontario, near where our campus was, but my job was on the outskirts of the city, and I would have to ride the bus to go out to work. And I remember one night when I was on the bus, rush hour-ish, and the bus was quite full, and I managed to get a seat fairly near the front of the bus. It was one of those sort of sideways-facing seats with lots of leg room, which is handy for me because I'm a bit tall. And there were lots of people that had gone on the bus after I did, and they had to stand. And I remember at one point there was a relatively older woman who got on, and she was standing there right next to me. Now, I knew what the right thing to do was. And in fact, there were even signs posted asking you to give up your seat. And I knew I was supposed to give up my seat, but I didn't. Because I was just being lazy. And there are lots of other times I can remember being inconsiderate to others, thinking of myself first. It's easy for us to make the ground rules for life in ways that make ourselves look good and others look bad. It's especially easy to do so, I think, as religious people. I think we Christians are particularly prone to thinking of rules as things that we are meeting, but other people are not. You ever drive to church sometimes and you're on your way to worship and you're dressed nicely and you're feeling good, and then you see those people who are just out jogging? Maybe it'd be a little bit better if they were coming to church like me, right? Sometimes how I think. It's not the right way to look at it. When we're being realistic, there is no room for self-righteousness in our lives. There's no justification for looking at ourselves as any better than anyone else. The great Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn, I think, said it well. He said, "The line between good and evil does not pass between nations or between social classes or between political parties. It passes right through every human heart." So if the first step in Jesus' teaching on the law is to show us that we are all imperfect and that we are all in need of God's grace, I think the second step is to move us beyond that. And in fact, to see in Him the one who fulfills the law on our behalf. In other words, He moves us beyond a recognition of our own need for grace to Himself, the very one in whom we receive that grace. One of the things that was a problem in Jesus' day was that the law was being seen as a dividing line between God's people and everyone else. It wasn't able to fulfill the purpose that God had given it to God's people for. God had given it not for a curse, but for a blessing. Not to tell people that they were wretched, but to reveal the good news of God's love to, through, and for them. We are not perfect, but Christ fulfilled the law perfectly for us, and His goodness is counted to us. I'm sure some of you, like we are fans of the TV show Downton Abbey. If you haven't seen it, it's a story of a very wealthy family in England who live in the countryside and have a great big luxurious manor house. And the family has many servants, maids, cooks, waiters, you name it, they have it. They get waited on hand and foot. And one of the interesting things about the show, for those of us who watch it, is to see the contrast between the wealthy family who lives upstairs in the manor house and the lower class people who work downstairs. Well, there was a recent episode where two of the servants had saved up a bit of money and they had a night off, And they decided to go out to eat in a fancy restaurant. And since it was a special occasion, they called ahead and made a reservation. And then when they got to the fancy restaurant, the person at the door in that very class-conscious society recognized right away that those weren't quite the type of people that he wanted in the restaurant. Well, luckily for them, the lady of the house, Lady Grantham, also happened to be dining in that same restaurant on that same evening. And as they were standing there having a debate with the person at the door, she walked past. And she saw a couple of people that she knew. And when the person at the door realized that these two people, in fact, knew Lady Grantham, he escorted them right to their table, which just a minute ago had been unavailable. You see, her status was counted to them. The truth is that none of us are perfect. None of us is able to live to the standard that God has called us to through the teaching of Jesus. But the truth is also that by that standard, that purity of heart and mind and faithfulness, Jesus was perfect. And his faithfulness and his love are counted to each one of us. And I think that we ought to continue to try to do our best, to strive for perfection in our own lives. But while we're doing so, also realize the grace that comes to us by putting our trust in Jesus, the one who is perfect on our behalf. I think perhaps the last step in Jesus' teaching on the law is to show us for what purpose God had given the law. See, Israel in Jesus' day saw the law as something which was a privilege for them. They were doing it, and therefore they were good. And all the other nations didn't know about it, really, and therefore weren't able to do it, and therefore weren't any good. And yet Jesus meant to show that God had given the law for really the same reason that God had called a people, that they might be a light to the nations, that their love for God and love for one another would create such an attractive way of living that all the nations would be drawn to it, and that through that way of living they would be brought into relationship with God, their Maker, God who loved them as well. Remember, I had this friend from high school, and after graduation, and some people went to university, and some people went to college, and other people went and got a job. He went and joined the military. I think he was the only friend I had from high school who went and joined the military after graduation. And I remember seeing him a few months later, and he was telling me a little bit about his basic training. And he said there was this one day when there were a big pile of bricks, and his commanding officer said to him, "Now I really need you to go and pile these bricks over here in such and such a way, right on this spot." So he went and he piled the bricks where he'd been told. And then no sooner had he finished, 2 or 3 hours later, but his commander came along again and said, I think we're going to need those somewhere else now. We're going to need them over here. And so one by one, he had to move the bricks over to the other spot. And then 2 or 3 hours later, when he finished that, the commander said, "No, I've changed my mind. I think we need those back over there." And of course, he had no choice but to move the bricks back. Now, that might strike us as rather an arbitrary and an unkind sort of set of rules. And yet rules such as that are meant in that context to humble the person being given the instructions and to test them, to test their willingness and enthusiasm and to follow directions. And through this testing and this humility, thereby to improve the individual as someone able to contribute to the larger organization and community. And I think those who have served in the military probably find that having gone through a common experience like that, it creates for them an incredibly strong bond, an incredibly deep kind of relationship, the kind of community, as it were, that can withstand even the most trying of circumstances. Jesus said elsewhere, "I have come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it." I think sometimes we Christians act as though Jesus came to abolish the law. And perhaps we are not liable for non-Christian interpretations of the law. But I think we are accountable to his interpretations of the law. It is very true that the teachings of Jesus can sound and even be very difficult for us. I think presidential candidate Jimmy Carter found that. And I think that we can find that whenever we hear the words simply read to us in church. And yet, considering the source, Jesus' very own mouth, I think we need to take it seriously and to wrestle with it. And the good news, I think, is that what we find in reflecting upon Jesus' teaching is not that it is harsh or meant to condemn us, but that it is a mean by which God's grace comes to us. Jesus reminds us that we are not perfect. And I at least find that a relief. And not only does he remind us that we're not perfect, he shows us that by that standard, he was, and that his perfection is counted to us. And even beyond that, he shows us that God has given us instructions about how to live as a way of creating relationships. Creating a relationship with us, helping us to create relationships with one another, and even more than that, for the purpose that we have been given an important role in God's plan for the world. That by following Jesus' teaching and trying to live by his example, that it is through us that God wishes to show love and grace for all people. That through us, God is inviting all of creation into relationship so that all others might know God's love as well.